how come the conversation isn't in support of men at the very bottom who clearly need help, who are being left behind by society, who have no options, who have no programs that specifically help men? If you're in a relationship that's abusive as a man and you're the one being threatened and hit and all that stuff, there is no men's group that you can go to talk about this. The double standard is insane.
The so-called gender paradox. That's a very interesting thing because it's really put their tails in a knot in Scandinavia. And that makes sense because the Scandinavians are going to have to deal with this first because they've gone the farthest down the road for like making their society gender equal.
But explain that to people if they don't mind.
I will. Okay, so imagine first of all that there's two kinds of equality that you might pursue. One would be equality of opportunity. And so that would mean that there's wide range of talent across people regardless of their type, whatever that might be, sex, gender, race, ethnicity. There's talent distributed everywhere. And it's a kind of a truism, and I would say a truism of the West in the deepest sense, that each of the individuals within those groups should be put in a position where their talents they're encouraged to manifest those talents, partly because that would be good for them spiritually and psychologically, but also because that would be of obvious benefit to the community. Right? I mean, talent's rare, which people don't understand. There's lots of different kinds of talent, but in each domain it's rare. And so it's to everyone's benefit to exploit talented people to the maximal possible degree. So even if you're just selfish, you'd want to push for equality of opportunity because the more talented people there are out there, the more cool stuff you get to have, and hopefully the more diverse and interesting your life is. So you can pursue equality of opportunity policies, and the Scandinavians have done that, especially trying to knock down barriers for women in the workplace. And by all accounts, by all standard theories, the Scandinavian countries and places like the Netherlands, Canada too, to a slightly lesser degree, have gone farther than any other countries in pursuing those policies. Part of the consequence of that is that some of the differences between men and women have been minimized. So obviously there's far more women in the workplace than there were 40 years ago. And in many occupations, there's actually dominance by women. There's dominance in the universities. There's dominance in the healthcare fields. And so women have poured into the workplace. And hypothetically, there's problems with that because it's put a lot of stress on family structure. But hypothetically, that's for the best, and because it gives people a broader range of choices and it gives everyone access to more talent. So, and then also, if you look around the world, you see that one of the best predictors of the probability of economic development in developing countries is the attitude in those countries towards equal rights for women, and it looks causal. The more positively the country is predisposed to female rights, the more likely they are to develop economically. And maybe that's because that indicates that they're open to new ideas or something like that, or open to transformation. So that's one kind of equality. Open up the playing field so that everybody has a chance to compete and cooperate and land where they will. But then the other kind of equality is equality of outcome. And that's often described as equity in today's language. And so the ultimate equity utopia would be take every job, every conceivable kind of job, and then stratify that by every conceivable level of authority within every job. And then ensure that every single category of person is represented in precise proportion to their prevalence in the population.
And that in and of itself is absolute madness. How are you going to take a CEO, say a board of directors at a company, and equally superimpose the demographics of a population into the board? How? How does that even make any sense to anybody with half a brain? And we wonder why we're going down the shitter in the West, because there's a bunch of people doing unqualified work simply for diversity and inclusion. We no longer promote based on merit. We got to hit quotas. There are plenty of people that are qualified to be doing some jobs that do not get hired. We have a ton of stories simply because what's in between their legs. And it's gotten to the point where some men have gotten fired. There was one story that we covered on this channel where a guy was the head of something, I believe at a hospital. He got fired and sued for millions of dollars and won. They replaced him with two women to do his one job that he was already doing. His performance metrics were through the roof. He was doing a great job. And simply for diversity, they fired him. So he ended up suing for wrongful termination, and he won. And I think he won like $10 million or $20 million. I can't remember what it was. We are virtue signaling to levels unseen today. And in the most, quote, egalitarian societies that he's mentioning, the Nordic countries, men and women choose the most diverse options to pursue for work. Alexander, thanks, brother. One of my favorite content creators, bro. Your whale roasts are hilarious. Thank you.
So every job should be 50% women and 50% men, and say 13% non-Western ethnic minority, and whatever that happens to be. And then you could break that down. And otherwise there's evidence of...
And in the world we live today in the West, with further segmentation, right, intersectionalism, now there is representation for marginalized groups of 1,000 different things. So how do you represent each little marginalized group from every corner of the country in a company? How? Why not make the playing field even in terms of opportunity? Everybody gets a shot to compete for a job, and may the best win. Why are we forcing people through the door? For what? To virtue signal? How does this make any sense to any adult in any room when this conversation gets brought up about how we should lead this country, how we should legislate inequality? When we talk about systemic oppression or systemic inequity, how does this conversation come up and everybody in the room, multiple people go, yeah, this sounds right? How in the world today?
Systemic prejudice. Okay, now, first thing to say about that is that's impossible. And the reason it's impossible is because there's no limit to the number of ways that you can categorize people into groups. So, you know about and ethnicity and race, maybe those are the obvious ones, but now you have gender, and then you have ethnicity, and and then there's attractiveness and intelligence and temperament and height and age and socioeconomic background. And I mean, let's say there's 20, but there's a lot more than that. There's no possible way that you could ever regulate a society so tightly that every single one of those groups was equally represented in every single one of those occupations at every single level of the hierarchy. Most working class people, let's say, are far more irritated with the intellectual elite than they are with the wealthy elite. And that's because they think they could become wealthy. And they could, but they don't think they could become part of the intellectual elite. And it isn't obvious to me that the intellectual elite, so those would be the liberal left-leaning types that dominate the media and academia, are particularly positive in their attitudes towards the typical working class person. I think they're prejudiced and elitist. I do believe that that's the case. And I think they're also, what would you call it, patronizing. And so they're much more concerned with the 1% who are the cognitive elite than they are the 1% who are the economic elite, because at least they think that's a game they could play. Psychologists have come to a pretty decent agreement about standard personality models, right? So there's extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness. And they look fairly stable cross-culturally. And that was all done by asking thousands of people hundreds and hundreds of questions and then grouping them statistically. So it was atheoretical, basically. It took computational power and statistics to find out that these are how traits group. So inextroverted people are sociable and happy, and neurotic people experience a fair bit of negative emotion. So that's the positive and negative emotion dimensions. Agreeable people are maternal, and disagreeable people are competitive, and there's a fair bit of male-female difference there. Conscientious people are dutiful and industrious and orderly, and the open people are creative. And so those are your basic 5 dimensions. Okay, so that's been established, and everyone more or less agrees on it. Now, maybe there's 7 dimensions, and we've got a questionnaire that breaks the 5 down into 10. That's called Understand Myself. But basically, there's good consensus on the 5. Okay, so now, as soon as you have the 5 basic traits, you can ask some questions like, well, do men and women differ? And so...
Nope. Gender is an identity. It's not rooted in biology. Men and women are not different whatsoever. They're exactly the same. There is nothing that separates us except the ideas in our head. That's the message we push today, and we have to go along with it. And if you say anything counter to that, you're the crazy one. You're the bigot. You're the phobic this, phobic that. You get labeled now. Again, like I said, we're virtue signaling, and the moment you don't agree with the narrative, you get ostracized and put in a little box along with everybody else.
Misogyny.
So what you do is you just give questionnaire. You can either fill it out yourself or have other people fill it out on your behalf. So, and it could be a teacher, it could be a parent, you know, and that's all being done. And what you find is there are systematic differences between men and women. And the biggest differences are that women experience more negative emotion and that they're more agreeable than men. So, and that's borne out by the psychiatric evidence, because higher levels of negative emotion are manifested in depression and anxiety, and women are diagnosed with higher levels of depression and anxiety all around the world. And with agreeableness, that's also borne out by the clinical literature in some sense, the medical literature, socio-medical literature, because disagreeable people are more likely to be incarcerated, because it's the best predictor of being incarcerated, even though it's not a very good predictor. And men are incarcerated at about a 10-to-1 rate compared to women, and are more likely to be antisocial and conduct disordered. So the personality...
That's another part of this argument the fembots never address, and I've always wondered why. Well, I know why, but they're always attacking that bell curve where the men concentrate power at the top, the highest performers, the ones who invent stuff, the billionaires, the world leaders, the drivers of companies, etc., tend to be all male. But yet the conversation isn't in support of the bottom percentile of men that are homeless on the streets, drug addicted, or incarcerated, or have mental issues. How come the conversation isn't in support of men at the very bottom who clearly need help, who are being left behind by society, who have no options, who have no programs that specifically help men? If you're in a relationship that's abusive as a man and you're the one being threatened and hit and all that stuff, there is no men's group that you can go to talk about this. The double standard is insane. There's no battered men's group. There's nothing, no options for you as a man. Almost none. You get a phone call, a 1-800 number here and there that everybody has access to, but there's far more support for women in all these aspects of society. Women do not champion these issues for men whatsoever. The only issues women are championing are the very ones at the tippy top, where they want to be presidents of companies, of countries. They want to be in senates, in Congress. They want all the halls of power, but they do not want to be in the ditch digging. They don't want to lay the bricks. They don't want to roof up a house. Absolute dead silence.
The differences are mirrored in the socio-medical literature. Okay, so there are differences, but then there's a question. Are those differences a consequence of socialization, or are they biological? And the answer to that is tricky, because how much something is social and how much it is biological actually depends on the social circumstances. So, well, here's an example. If you have a society where no one has enough to eat and people are starving, then there's a huge cultural effect on people's intelligence, let's say, that's mediated by economic factors, even though it's got a biological origin, right? The starvation. So the relationship between biology and culture is actually partly culturally dependent, so it makes it complicated. But in any case, here's how the scientists decided to address this. They thought, well, why don't we rank order countries by how egalitarian their social policies are, which you can do with a fair degree of reliability. You know, you put the countries where women are second-class citizens at the bottom, and you'd put the Scandinavian countries at the top. You can get good reliability across raters for how you'd rate those countries. And then look at the magnitude of the differences between men and women by the egalitarian social policies. And so then you'll find out, and here's the hypothesis. If the differences between men and women are primarily social, then as cultures become more egalitarian, men and women will become more alike. That's not what happened. The opposite happened. The more egalitarian the society, and it turns out the richer the society, because that's also being discovered now, the more different men and women become. And so the differences are not huge. So with agreeableness, for example, if you took the average man, if you took a typical man and a typical woman out of the population, just randomly, and you had to bet that the woman was more aggressive than the man, you'd be wrong 60% of the time. So there's quite a bit of overlap, right? Because you'd be right 40% of the time. But the problem is that a lot of selection takes place at the extremes. Maybe you're only concerned about disagreeable people when they become violent, and maybe it's only the 1 in 50 most disagreeable person who's violent, and they're all men. So you can have quite a bit of similarity at the average level and big differences at the extremes. And the extremes is where people do things like employment selection. So the biggest difference that's been discovered between men and women, and this is the one that gets biggest in the Scandinavian countries, is interest. Men are more interested in things, and women are more interested in people. And it's a big difference. It's one full standard deviation. And so what that means is that if you were a man, you would have to be more interested in people than 85% of men to be as interested in people as the 50th percentile woman. And you'd have to be more interested in things than 85% of women to be as interested in things as the typical man. You cannot have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome at the same time. It's not possible. Because as you make your society more egalitarian and you open up the opportunity for equality of outcome, you increase how different men and women are, and that changes their occupational choice. So if men are more interested in things, which they are by a substantial margin, then way more of them are going to be engineers. There are fewer women mathematicians in the higher echelons. Okay, but here's something interesting.
And that's despite the massive push for women in STEM fields. Despite the massive push. Despite companies bending over backwards to hire women in STEM. They'll do anything the moment a woman applies, dude. I don't even have to tell you the stories. You could read them for yourself, for men, by men in the comment section that work in STEM fields, how much companies bend over to try to get a woman on the team.
About mathematical ability. First of all, it's very rare, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now, it looks like, if you look in junior high, that mathematically gifted men and males and females are approximately as common. Now, there's a little bit of debate about that because there is some evidence that maybe at the very upper extremes there's a male advantage, just like there's a male disadvantage at the low end, because the male distribution for intelligence might be flatter. And so that's the greater male variability hypothesis. There's been papers putting that forward that have been retracted as a consequence of pressure from politically correct people, even though greater male variability is actually quite common in the animal kingdom for a variety of reasons. Men are more expendable, that males are more expendable in some ways, or you could say that males are more likely to pursue high-risk, high-return strategies. You can look at it either way, and it's certainly possible. In any case, the males in junior high who happen to be mathematically gifted are less likely to also be verbally gifted, whereas that doesn't seem to be the case for the females. And so if you're a male math nerd, then math is a pretty logical pathway for you because you don't have as many other options. Whereas if you're a female math nerd, you have other options because you're more likely to also be verbally gifted. And so that's enough to, at least in principle, account for some of the reason why there are fewer women mathematicians than men mathematicians. And men are also more likely to work longer hours. And if you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. There's a nonlinear return on. That's a good thing for everybody who's listening to know. If you have a job, you want to be the guy or the woman who's working that extra 10% because the return on that is nonlinear. So that's a really useful thing to know. Men are more likely to work outside. They're more likely to work in dangerous businesses. They're more likely to run full-time businesses rather than part-time businesses. And they're more likely to move in pursuit of their career goals. And that all contributes to differences in...
Yeah, and then men will more likely sacrifice everything in pursuit of their goals in business, which would include family, work-life balance, any of the above. A man's willing to slave away and sleep in the office. Okay, perfect example, Elon Musk. Dude sleeps in the office, never home, works countless hours. Probably the closest people to him and the higher-ups that he's hired as engineers most likely all do the same. Most men. You think a woman with a family wants to spend hours and hours at a company, sleep in the office, wake up at 4 a.m., go to work, code, do all this stuff? You think there's a lot of women naturally that would do that? We're interested in different things. And it's not something that should be seen as a negative, man. Why don't we set up society in a way that's beneficial to both genders? Why can't we recognize our differences as strengths? And why can't we play that up in society? There are things women do that are better than men, no matter how much men try, and vice versa. There are things that men do that are better than women. Why can't we harness this power to create a better outcome for society and people at large living it? Why must we force this equality on everybody? Beats me, dude.
And in among Uber drivers, they make 7% more money because they drive faster.
Ha. Uber driver men make 7% more because they drive faster. What a weird stat, dude. How quirky is that one? We end the video on that one alone.